Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, the Beatles had a rough time in America because of John and his interview stating that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. They had their records burned and the press wanted an apology, and John gave a half-hearted one. After that, the Beatles were afraid of touring and were getting tired of it because they were of all the traveling. After that, Brian had trouble with his old love Dizz, and things just seemed to be falling apart. So let's see what's going on today. When the Beatles decided not to tour again in the year 1966, by the middle of the year, many of Brian's staff figured that he was having big business problems. And Brian didn't usually talk about his business issues with his colleagues. At this time, there was a British economic recession, and it was having a marked effect on booking fees on some of his lesser artists, and it caused him to compromise his loyalties. Tommy Quick was out of NEMS, signed by another agency. Epstein passed on his option to re-sign Michael Haslam and the Rustics. Two other groups, Tony Rivers and the Castaways and the Paramounts, went to the other companies. Neither had the impact anticipated by Brian. Brian was starting to tighten up his organization. He told his colleagues with regret he would have to act decisively when all attempts at promoting certain artists had failed. About 40 musicians, with the Beatles and Cilla way out in front, had earning potential. The rest were small profit makers or were being subsidized. Some 80 staff members now occupied 5 NEMS rented offices around London. As the business problems seemed insurmountable, Brian never lost his smiling confidence. He predicted Billy J. Kramer, You Make Me Feel Like Someone, and Jerry and the Pacemakers, A Girl on a Swing, would be top 10 British hits. But Brian was wrong. Neither ever reached the charts, and it bruised Brian's pride in his pocket. Next, the Saville Theatre. It was an aesthetic joy, but it was costing him money. He imported the musical Amen Corner to the Saville from the Edinburgh Festival, but it lost money. The thing was, Brian had good instincts. After his death 20 years later, the show would be a theatrical success. But in Brian's lifetime, even though Brian's name gave the play big press publicity, the theater was unable to fill the 2,800 seats after 3 nights. The Saville was proving to be a magnificent but expensive substitute for Brian's failed acting ambitions. The problems he was having caught the eye of the media, and there was a cartoon by Neil Smith in the New Musical Express that depicted the Saville as Epstein's dollhouse. Brian commented, "I don't care much for the 3 chins he's given me, and I'm not sure that I like the theme of all the artists appearing as puppets with me as a manipulator. That's not strictly true." To friends, though, Brian said it was clever and accurate. For the first 9 months of the Saville, Brian was possessive. He gave little leeway to John Linden as production director. Brian was everywhere in the theater, checking the running order of the shows, concerning himself with the amount of the time allotted to each stage act. When Brian went to the performance, he could never sit through the 2 hours. He stalked the theater. At the end of the evening, somehow he would know who had been cheated on the clock by overstaying the time allotted on stage. The production director, John Linden, was a strong-minded man, and he was the same age as Brian. Brian would never stay in the room if he knew that John was mad. John said Brian could never face people's anger and have a stand-up argument. Jeffrey Ellis said that Brian found the Saville even more of a problem than he expected. He knew he would have to spend more money on it than he could stand. It needed a total refurbishment, pulling out 1,200 seats and replacing them, and then having new carpets. He was upset that he couldn't afford to revamp the Saville as he would have liked, but he spent a lot of time there. For a while, he had my confidence. Ellis said he would say to me, "I'm determined to turn it around, but my God, what a lot it's costing. What a lot of effort and trouble." And there was always a conflict between Brian's pride and his commercial good judgment. An example was when the Four Tops were on a British tour of the Gaumont and Odeon theaters. They were a leading American act, and it was arranged by Vic Lewis in his role as NEMS managing director. It was scheduled to begin January 1967. If the show attracted fans, it would be a profit for NEMS. If it wasn't a huge success, it would break even. Brian, though, wanted to put his own personality on the event. He flew to Detroit and gave out concessions. He agreed to pay the group's tax, first-class airfares, and other unnecessary bonuses. The result was an amended contract that guaranteed trouble. Even if the tour was a success and sold out, NEMS would lose £10,000. And it did. Just as Tito Burns predicted, Brian's meddling with deals once they had been closed was causing havoc. The Four Tops were also booked at the Saville. This engagement too lost money, but Brian glowed in the wings. The concert was a success. The Four Tops at the Saville cemented Brian's plans to stage significant pop events every Sunday at the Ailing Theatre. He wanted it to be like the Olympia in Paris, with artists booked for a week. His bookings in 1967 included stars who would endure as legends: Little Richard, Cream featuring Eric Clapton, The Who, and Fats Domino. There was a positive pleasure in the Saville for Brian. He loved being responsible to Lord Chamberlain for its correct operation. And pop shows of a high caliber made it a Sunday night mecca for swinging London. But one full night a week did not make a profitable theater. Too often the place was closed for 6 nights. Brian's year wasn't getting any better when he got a call from his brother Clive in Liverpool. Their father, Harry, had been rushed to Sefton General Hospital. Harry and Queenie had recently moved from Queen's Drive to a smaller home. They were living at Treetops, Glenrose Road, Woolton. Harry was preparing to go to dinner one night and suffered a massive heart attack. Brian rushed to the hospital and was told that Harry would be in the hospital for 6 weeks. When he returned home, he was so ill he had to go back to the hospital, making Harry stay an 11-week stay altogether. There was excitement at the hospital among the other patients when his famous son arrived, so Harry told Brian, "Go and wave to the ladies." And Brian, being modest, said no, he was not a star. That Christmas, Brian went home to stay with the parents that he still called Mummy and Daddy. He took his father a box of colored shirts and ties and was happy to see his father mobile. Harry got bad news that he had to slow down in his work. Harry thought work was therapy, and Brian was pleased that at least his father was out of the hospital bed and planning a holiday in Bournemouth. Brian was in the midst of renegotiating the Beatles recording contract with an EMI, and he faced the wrath of British fans. They hadn't seen the Beatles concert in a year. They were mad that the Beatles were on a long tour of America, and they felt they were being deprived of live appearances. Brian deflected the attack by emphasizing the need to ensure the group's safety. Brian kept getting the same questions wherever he went. Had the Beatles split? John Lennon was in Spain making a movie, How I Won the War. George Harrison was in Bombay studying the sitar. Ringo went to see John while he was making the movie. Epstein told Disc and Music Echo, "There's no real question of the Beatles retiring. They're simmering down, making films, writing music, making records. That's their future." And then people in show business are asking, how long can the Beatles last? And has Epstein lost his touch? Brian responded by saying, "All I can say is that I hope their artists are as happy and successful as mine in 3 years' time. After 29 years of no hits, I did produce the Beatles, Cilla, Jerry, Billy J., and others." He pointed out that his new American group, The Circle, and his plans to expand Jerry into theater, which did materialize, and the foremost growth in cabaret. Brian said that just because some people aren't having hits doesn't mean they're not doing well, or that I'm gradually withdrawing from pop. I'm as keen as ever. They place their faith in me, and I'm deeply aware of my responsibility. Brian was still great at his public speeches, but his business and private lives were uneasy near the Christmas of 1966. Wendy said he was getting very foggy and seemed to hibernate at Chapel Street, and she was covering for him a lot. Brian felt a need for attention, and in lack of permanent company, it became clear to even the junior member of his staff. So at Hill's house, a receptionist named Jill Forbes, who was 20, talked about weekend parties she held at the Marble Arc flat that she shared with Laurie McCaffrey and NEMS receptionist. Their parties made it to the pages of the national newspapers. Brian called Jill into his office, and she expected to be given a hard time because of the secrecy agreement that all Brian's employees had signed. He said to her, "I hear that this is the second weekend that you've been having these parties. I think it's pretty miserable." Jill felt guilty and said, "I'm terribly sorry. We shouldn't have done." And Brian said, "I think it's pretty miserable that nobody should think of inviting me. I would really love to have come." Jill sensed a man in need of a good friend. He would ask her to go to Hill House on Saturday mornings. There was no work for her to do. She realized that she was there to provide him with company, place his racing bets with the bookmaker, or be sent to buy his aftershave from the galleries of Lafayette and Regent Street. Her loyalty to him, even as a junior, was instinctive. He was a nice, kind man who gave an incredible quality to my life. He was fantastically perceptive, generous, thoughtful, sad, pathetic. I couldn't fault him, but now I can see that he was desperately lonely and needed a stable partner. Wendy Hansen had quit several times as his personal assistant. One time Brian refused her resignation and said, "Why don't we have an evening out? And I'm not accepting your resignation. Let me take you to dinner." And Brian poured out the charm over dinner, and he had his chauffeur pick her up. Wendy would encourage him to concentrate on the theatrical aspects of his life. She said, "Look, Brian, just because the Beatles aren't going to perform, your life hasn't come to an end. You have such potential. You have imagination. You wanted to become an actor, and now you have a theater. Why not stand London on its ear? Put on a season of young British playwrights, people who have talent, but who are not yet commercial. Do it. Get on with it. You can't spend your life in pop music." And Brian warmed to the idea. Then Wendy turned serious. "You got to do something with your life. And first of all, you have to stop taking drugs." She recalls, "I talked him into it, but he did a trick which I now know about. He said, 'I'm too famous to go to a clinic, so I'll have to do it at home.'" Chapel Street was swept clean of all of Brian's substances, and nurses were drafted in for a few days. You can't just clean up and go back to life. You have to join a follow-up group. And nobody mentioned this to Brian. Wendy stated that Brian had seesaw behavior. She said that he was often difficult, demanding, impossible, like that. Jeffrey Ellis said that Brian didn't like his own company. He would love to have had a stable relationship, a marriage of any sort, which he didn't receive. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. I think he was lonely rather than solitary. Lyndon said it was like he was on stage playing a part, giving a performance 24 hours a day. He was a very lonely man. Wendy's patience gave out one night when he called her at 10 o'clock in the evening. He had lost the address of a recording studio where he had been due 4 hours earlier, and he started shouting at her, and he said, "You ought to know where to find it. You're my assistant." Wendy icily said, "I'm not your nanny. I'm really not putting up with this any longer. I'm going to lead a normal life. And goodbye." She resigned by letter the next day and went to join film producer David Putnam. A footnote on the page said, a few months after Wendy left, she got a call from Brian, and he said that she was the only person who could do a Herculean task for him, getting permission from many world famous to use their images on the cover of the Beatles LP, Sgt. Pepper. And she did it for Brian. And before all that, Wendy worked off her notice, and Brian remained absent. Finally, he arrived at Hill House and slammed his door, buzzed her on his intercom, and said frostily, "Will you come in, Miss Hansen?" She entered and said, "Good evening, Mr. Epstein." He looked at her sheepishly, and then he said, "I suppose it's too late to ask you to do my Christmas shopping?" Wendy said no. She had nothing else to do, having passed all the office work to Joanne. She spent the next morning at Asprey's buying decanters and silverware, within Brian's set budgets of £10 for most gifts. The only people Brian shopped for personally every birthday, anniversary, and Christmas were his parents. The Beatles sent her a farewell gift, and Brian refused to part from her without a promise of continuing friendship. Wendy Hansen, too, left with affection for the impossible man she had almost tamed. There was something very lost about him. So I'm going to end the video here. In this episode, Brian was going through some losses and bad judgments. He put his money into his own theater, but it was costing more than it should, and he wasn't making money on it. He then realized he needed to trim his business down during the British recession, and that was rough for him. Brian's father, he suffered a heart attack, and Brian's father realized he had to slow down on his work, which he regarded as therapy. Lastly, he lost his personal assistant, Wendy Hansen. She had been his right hand, but she reached her limit with his bossy ways. He still loved her and said that he wanted to remain friends with her. Brian never liked losing contact with people he cared about. As I mentioned before, I created a list of merchandise from Amazon that I thought you might be interested in. And if you click on the link, it takes you to the Amazon page. If you purchase it, I get a small commission that is of no extra cost to you. But more importantly, I want to wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.